Now you know.
Well, hi everybody. I'm usually the guy behind the camera, and this time, this is the guy usually in front of the camera. But I wanted to welcome you to this our initial book presentation and signing here at bluMoon Books in Sacramento. It's nice seeing the audience here, and just to let you know, we're streaming this live, and we have a number of people around the country who are going to be viewing it. And it's also going to be available on a YouTube playback. So whatever link you guys receive to get this, and we can also send another link out, you'll be able to see it. So I think we'll have a nice audience. My name is Patrick Shepard, and I'm not really the main book person here. I have a little camera shy person back behind. Lene Orr is my wife and partner, my lovely wife. And it's really her vision to do this. She really, it's really her mission to see that the local independent bookstores are alive and well in Sacramento. I think a lot of people agree with that. And then to round out the family here, our beloved daughter Jenna, along with her friend Christina, are running our camera back there, and hope to have them as part of the book and family business. She's been a reader ever since she was 3 years old, and so I think it's a good fix. Just a couple more things. We're going to have additional topics coming up next month. You people may have seen Steve Swat was in, and he's going to be, him and his wife are going to be speaking about California politics. He had a book called Game Changers, the 12 Elections That Transformed California, and it was nice seeing him here. And additionally, we're having an author who Bill suggested, who's going to give us a good look at baseball franchise players. Is that
baseball players who spent their whole career on one team? It's a very select group of guys over the history of baseball. So
great. And then April is Poetry Month, and I think we have one other thing too. But we're going to. Do we use Nextdoor? Arden is the good way that we get this out. So anyway, but now to our speaker on hand. It's my pleasure to introduce Bill George, a local author who has produced numerous California historical books and video. I've known Bill for years as a fellow video journalist and producer. Ironically, we were both raised in Chicago. We now live in Sacramento, and we come from the days when we went to college, where we worked as steel workers in the big steel mills, which I'm afraid aren't there anymore. So it was a very tough job, but the money was good, and we learned a lot about life. Bill has produced a great video on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. I may not be getting this exactly right, but Bill, and what I like about it is he takes us on little side trips to where you can like drive to certain places and take
where to eat.
What's
Where
that?
to eat?
Where to eat too? Okay. And I keep talking about Cape Horn, which has got a great bar, but it's also got an incredible. How deep is the canyon? Like a couple thousand.
Yes.
Couple thousand.
Yeah.
And then another place too, where we recently visited up near Sierra Ski Ranch, right at the old Donner Summit. You've got the tunnels going through there, the sheds, and also the tunnels. So anyway, without any further ado, here's Mr. George, and he's going to play a clip from his video also.
Yeah, we'll play a few clips. So.
All right.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and congratulations on opening this store. I think it's great, taking the leap and opening a bookstore, and hopefully people will read in the future. It won't all be pictures and symbols, although I'm afraid maybe it will be. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, I was thinking of, Patrick mentioned the steel mill, and yes, I worked at U.S. Steel. Were you at U.S. Steel too?
Yes.
Yeah, we're both at U.S. Steel, which is, it's another world. It's truly makes me, and it wasn't that long ago, 40 some years ago. And my mother passed away this year, and I was fortunate enough to go back to Chicago and be with her when she passed. But Patrick reminded me, I wasn't planning to say this, but I was with her, and you're there in the room and all night, all the time. And there was a documentary on, and it was by a woman I knew years ago, and it was about the steel mills of Chicago. Talk about serendipity, or whatever. But it was just amazing to sit there and see that. And, just like this is an era with what I wrote about that's now gone. And so the Transcontinental Railroad was the vision of Abraham Lincoln, among other people, but Lincoln, obviously being president, had the ability to implement the vision. Sacramento, of course, became famous during the gold rush. And I don't think we in Sacramento realize how famous. We think that, it was here, but so was San Francisco. But Sacramento was, and I think most historians agree, much, much more important at the time than San Francisco. And that's because it was right at the base of where you had to be to get into the gold fields. So it all happened here. Also, John Sutter had established Sutter's Fort here prior to the gold rush. So people were coming overland already in very small numbers, only maybe a few hundred a year through the 1840s. But they were headed not to California, not even to Sacramento. They were headed to Sutter's Fort. It was known throughout the world. It was famous. And one of the reasons it was famous was John Sutter and Sutter's Fort were the pivot point in California. Spain had been very weak. They had collapsed. Mexico had taken them, so we were Mexican territory, part of Mexico. But they were very weak. They didn't have the funds to control this far-off province from Mexico City. So you had the Mexicans here. Now you had the Americans coming in, settling off on the Rio Americano River. You had the French Navy off the coast. You had the British in Vancouver. And you had those pesky Russians up in Fort Ross. The whole thing was in play. Everybody wanted they wanted it. They thought we could have been Russia. We could have been Great Britain. We could have been conceivably France, and certainly could have remained Mexico. But it was the fulcrum. The Spanish had allowed Sutter's grants, a big grant of property here, so that he would be a countervailing force with Russia, especially. That was their big concern, but also with the Brits and the French. So it was a crucial place, well known throughout the world, and people came from all over. So Sacramento is the place, and the gold rush then just accelerates everything. Now, what had happened in the gold rush? So it wasn't just people coming in and running up to the mines. They had to be outfitted. They had to be equipped. They had to have roads to go on. So there was a group of people in Sacramento that, as I say in the book, developed the necessary mining, grading, and road building skills that made this an ideal place to begin the railroad. Now, the first major railroad in California was the Sacramento Valley Railroad that went from R Street, the R Street corridor, where they're redeveloping now, out to Folsom. That was important. It was a local railway, surely, but again, it gave people this, including the famous engineer Theodore Judah, who came out here from the east to really work on it. He was hoping to build the Transcontinental Railroad. So he came out here, he worked on that railroad, and built that one from Sacramento to Folsom. So now you had the skill sets and everything else. So Judah, who's called Crazy Judah, not because he's crazy, but he's so passionate about what he's doing that he buttonholes everybody he can get. He's so possessed by it that he goes back to Washington, D.C. And in the Capitol, in an act that would shock and amaze and horrify everyone today, he opens up an entire room in the U.S. Capitol and turns it into an exhibit so that he hopes to get Congress to fund his railroad. So he puts in basically a big museum that is a sales tactic to try to get Congress to go ahead and fund it. So he comes back and forth, which was not easy in those days, sailing from California to D.C. and back, trying to find the political support for it and also the financial support for it. So he's in Sacramento, late 1850s, and he's going around talking to people. Then he goes to San Francisco. And he's really hopeful, and he writes to his wife, I have a meeting with the biggest industrial and financial concern in the state, biggest business and financial concern in the state of California. And I'm really hopeful that these folks are going to come through and fund the railroad. So nobody seems to know who this company was, but if you look at it, it had to be Wells Fargo. It had to be Wells Fargo. They were the only ones that were that big at the time. And also, he had an office here in Sacramento that was in the same building as Wells Fargo was in at the time. So I just think, now, other historians disagree with me, but I think that was the one. Well, they turn it down. And why would they turn down the Transcontinental Railroad? Why would they do that? Well, what do they have? They've got overland mail. They've got stagecoaches. They have businesses that compete with a potential railroad. So they are thinking, hey, first of all, this is expensive. It's dicey. It might not work. We're not going to back it. So they pull out of it, and they devastate Judah, and he's very disappointed. Somehow he, again, he buttonholed everybody. So he goes to, gets what is called today the Big Four. It was actually a larger group, about 8 to 10 people who were prominent Sacramento business people. Leland Stanford, of course, Mark Hopkins, Huntington, and Crocker, the famous Big Four. And then, as I said, other people like Benjamin Leite are kind of lost to history, but were very important people too. And he goes to them and he pitches the idea, and he sells it to them. Now, they are wealthy, but they're not super wealthy. The common belief is at the time, San Francisco starts to scoff at them. At this era in American history, and probably even today, but not as pronounced as it was then, cities are really rivals. So Sacramento and San Francisco are rivals. They hate each other. They want business to develop in their town, not in San Francisco. And so they both think, we, as a city, we are vying with Sacramento. Sacramento is vying with San Francisco. So as soon as the Sacramentans sign up and do this thing, in the newspapers, especially the Daily Alta newspaper, they start to heap scorn upon the Big Four. Now, the Daily Alta, there is a town in California. If you drive up 80, you'll see it, and it's in my book. And it's called Alta. Gee, how did that happen? Well, when the Big Four got to Alta, up there, they decided to name that town Alta to kind of stick it in the face of San Francisco and see, so you call it, your newspaper tried to skewer us. Well, here it is. Here's Alta in your face, San Francisco. So there's all these kind of little stories about it. So they go ahead and they convince the Big Four to do it. As I said, they're not super rich. They basically pledge all the money they've got to it. They say Huntington, who becomes the richest and most powerful of the Big Four, and hated by progressives throughout all time, by the way. That's another story. But he says at one time that he would gladly get out of this deal. He's given everything that he's got in it. He'd gladly get out of it to figuratively just get the shirt off his back because he felt like they were over-leveraged, which they were. They did get... there's hard to describe this. It's like a second mortgage on the house. But when Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad bill, the federal government did extend loans to them. However, they had to build the first 30 miles or so. They had to pay for it and build the whole railroad through it. And at times they were desperately short of funds until they were able to construct the railroad into the foothills. Then they were finally able to get money and also land grants, which they were able to sell off. All these things become enormously controversial in history. But what's really interesting is that you can go to Lincoln, and of course Lincoln's not on the Transcontinental Railroad route, but that's, as I said, where the first railroad was built. And you can still find land deeds that have Theodore Judah's name on them. My family has an old book from an ancestor, and she talks in that book about buying land from the railroad for their property to put their house on it. So what they did was they gave the railroad what they called checkerboard, so they give the railroad one plot of land, and then the government would hold the other plot. This excluded existing cities, streams, other valuable properties, so they didn't give them the most valuable property, but they gave them the rights to some of that land, all the way into Utah, to Promontory. So that's how the government figured that it would recoup its money, because if somebody puts a business there, then that makes their property that much more valuable to put a business on there. So again, it was one of Lincoln's ideas and his advisors to do that. And of course, Lincoln also came up with the Homestead Act, which is similar to this, where you gave land to people to develop and homestead, and also the land grant colleges that we have, especially in the Midwest. And I went to one, University of Missouri. It was a land grant college. So again, Lincoln's idea. So all this comes together. Now, you've got the money, you've got the team. What are you going to do? You're going to build a mountain over the Sierra Nevada, a railroad over the Sierra Nevada. 7,000 feet elevation from Sacramento to over the mountain and then into Truckee. Nowhere in the world had this been done before. There had been some shorter segments, but nothing on this scale. I showed my film to a group of engineers, modern engineers, obviously, American Society of Civil Engineers. And what they told me was they were amazed at just logistically how could it have happened. Say you're going up and you're going up to different terrains. You're going around hills, you're going on flat, then you're going up. You have to build trestles, you have to build culverts, you have to build stone bridges, you have to build wooden bridges, just to have the material to go from a flat land to a trestle, then through a tunnel. Think about that, granite. They're like, how could they have marshaled all of that stuff at that time? At the time, there was little industrial capacity in the state. All of the rails, all of the locomotives, all of the, I believe, everything except the wooden ties, basically, the spikes, the hammers, everything came by ship from the east around the Cape Horn to San Francisco. It was offloaded there at the wharves there, unloaded on schooners, brought up the river to Old Sacramento, offloaded there, put on wagon trains up to the mountains to the point of the railhead where they built the railroad. So again, I remember there's one book I read, and it said something about how they put Huntington, one of the big four, he went back and he was in New York. And he became kind of the financial wizard of the railroad. He keeping them afloat through bonds and other mechanisms and selling shares and anything he could to keep it alive. But he was also the guy who ordered the supplies. And this was an enormous job. Now the Civil War's breaking out. So things like gunpowder, which you need to blast through the mountains and the hills, is scarce. The price of steel, which comes from Europe, is extremely high. And all the prices of everything are high. And then the shipping. So somebody wrote in a book, said something like, well, they had to put a change order in. How would you put a change order in when, it's going to take you 6 months or something to ship this stuff around the Cape? But whatever. Somehow they pulled it off, got all the stuff there. So there's delays. Other factors, the weather, of course, as we all know, in the state. They kind of thought, and Judah thought, it doesn't snow in the Sierra. I've been here 3 or 4 years, and there's no snow up there, not like the Midwest. So he doesn't even think about the problem of snow until they're up in the mountains. He actually had died, and then they said, oh my God, look at this snow. They had a couple really bad years. I think 1868 was one. And that's when they knew they had to modify the plan, add tremendous cost to it, and build snow sheds all the way from about above Colfax all the way over the summit. Otherwise, those trains were not powerful enough to operate in the heavy snow of the Sierra. So constant changing. Of course, labor. Where are you going to get the people? So again, California's population isn't quite as big as it is today. And the other problem was it was pretty itinerant in the terms that it was largely still male. There were families here, but they had come for the gold rush, and they were adventurers. And if there was no gold, then the gold rush kind of went up and down in waves. Obviously 48, 49, everybody's out looking for gold. Placer gold kind of levels out. They go to hard rock mining, different iterations. So when they're not mining, they're happy to work on the railroad. But the minute somebody strikes a new find somewhere, off they go. And then I think it's 1862 or 3, they find the Comstock lode in Nevada. And all these folks run off to Nevada. Boom. They can't hire them for any price. So the workforce is gone. So what do? They turn to the Chinese. There are lots of stories and legends about this one. I made a separate film called Chinese Builders of Gold Mountain, which I think tells, as far as I could tell, a little bit of a controversial story about the Chinese, but hopefully it's highly accurate, different views on it. Why were the Chinese in California in 1862-63 when they were able to be hired in large numbers? Anybody? One event? Anybody? Anybody? Class? Remember Ferris Bueller's Day Off? Class. Sorry? No, they didn't come for the Delta levees. That was afterwards. But like everybody else, the gold rush was the largest free migration of people in the history of civilization. They came for the gold in 1849, 50, like everybody else. And they were gold miners, and they were fairly successful. In my film, I go up to Marysville. They go to Yuba City. I don't know, what is that? Something's beeping. Okay, the alarm next door. Hopefully no one's breaking in. Be a hero. Stop the robbery. So anyway, they're here for the gold rush. And I went to Marysville, Yuba City. If you haven't done that, Yuba City especially has a really interesting temple and also a museum. And I think it's going off.
Oh, it stopped.
It doesn't just stop.
It's frying my brain right now. It's controlling me. I am not a Martian. Okay. Anyway, so people came, and in those cases, Marysville as well, there's a museum there, and those date back to the gold rush. And there's a temple in Marysville, the Buckeye Temple, which when the levee broke, or the floodgate broke last week, the legend was that before that Buckeye always protected Marysville from the floods. And I wrote on Facebook that Buckeye would come through again, and darn if he didn't. So tell people why Marysville, Yuba City didn't flood, because the Chinese gods protected them. But so anyway, there was a thriving Chinese community here. They developed a two-way trade, first really trans-Pacific trade in history between California and China. Very brisk. Merchants came over, sold things, and so there was a large workforce here. As I said, as the gold rush came and went, there were a number of Chinese. So the Big Four put ads in the papers. The Chinese were basically hired by their own people. They were subcontractors to the railroad. So they would talk to, the Chinese that they knew. They had to know each other very well, because the Chinatown in Sacramento is along I Street. You know where the federal courthouse building is that towers over Old Town? That's where Chinatown was, and right across the street. Every year, according to the Sacramento Union, the Chinese merchants would throw a big party for the American merchants. And it was an 8-course dinner with champagne. So despite the hostilities that arose later on in California history, early on, there was much more unanimity, if you will, or at least cooperation at that period. And you'll see that if you see the Chinese film. It's really interesting. And this is from the people that, the descendants who tell the story of their families and how this all worked out. So anyway, there were a lot of Chinese, and between 10 to 12,000 were hired on the railroad between here and the summit, actually Truckee, to work on that railroad. So they're out and they're digging the roadbed. They are doing the supplies. Some are working on carpenters. There's also Anglos working on it. So it's a wonderful project that goes up over the mountains. When they get into Utah, a lot are laid off, because Brigham Young says, if you're going to go through Utah, you're going to hire Mormons. So they had to deal with that as well. With Leland Stanford and the Big Four had to deal with that. So the railroad was designed purposely by the government to be a race. They wanted it done quickly. The Civil War was breaking out. Union was worried that they were going to lose California, that California was in play politically, and like many railroads in many countries, the first one of the big priorities was the national defense. So they wanted it done quickly. Now we look back and say, well, the war ended in 1865. Well, in 1862, they don't know that, or 63 or 64, even as late as 64, 63 Gettysburg, There's still defeats for the Union Army. So the government wants this as a race. So you've got the Central Pacific, it's called the railroad here in Sacramento, starts here, and then the Union Pacific starts in Omaha, and it's a race. Whoever goes fastest and gets the most land, they get reimbursed more per mile, the more miles they lay. So it's very interesting to see what they did. The railroad was criticized a lot by people who said it was shoddy construction. I don't think that's true personally. I think it was as good as they did under the time pressure that they had. And then they continually straightened the line, reinforced the line, really used best practices. The engineers who built the Central Pacific Railroad, especially, are some of the most famous railroad engineers in the history of the world. So we had Theodore Judah, unfortunately died before any of it was laid, but he was a surveyor. He had envisioned it all. A guy named William Hood came along and took his job. And Hood became one of the best engineers in the world. He built the railroad after it was complete across the country. He built it south, down the Central Valley, and then into Arizona. And if you want to look up something interesting, it's called the Tehachapi Loop, which is a huge loop down in the Central Valley area, or south of that. And it's an engineering marvel, and the railroad actually curves over itself twice, I think, and it's just an amazing thing to see. So these guys were just incredible. They also went on to build water plants. Somebody talked about levees, built the levees. It was really the beginning of modern California, engineering-wise and city-wise, and really improved the quality of life for everybody. So the Union Pacific, second time I hit that, Union Pacific's racing, the Central Pacific's racing, and they come together at Promontory, Utah, about 680 miles or so from Sacramento, and they join, and that's the famous picture of the shaking of the hands. And now they're big rivals. So two railroads, they hate each other. They hate each other. And in fact, they hate each other so much that when you took the train out as a passenger from the east, you had to get off the Union Pacific cars onto the Central Pacific cars. I don't know exactly where that was. I might have been a Promontory, I don't know, but you had to shift cars, so that went on for a while. The railroad became extremely important to California. So, as I said, Judah was the surveyor, but that doesn't mean that he just did right angles and, how are we going to do this? He also wrote a business plan, and his business plan talked about how much money would they realize from shipping goods, how much money would they realize from shipping agriculture, and how much money would they realize from tourism. Those are the big three elements that they saw. So it became a big deal in tourism, and I'll show a little bit of the film, but people now could get to California in 3 or 4 days. And it's really interesting because the Cincinnati Reds baseball team, so the railroads are joined May 17th, 1869. The Cincinnati Reds baseball team, which I think was undefeated or something crazy, came out to play the Rubes out here in baseball 4 or 5 months after that, and they complained about how rough the ride was. Not, I guess, realizing that a few months before that, you'd have, taken you 6 months to walk out here. So people quickly got, used to the modern transportation, started complaining about, this isn't really that great a ride, or the food's bad, and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of amazing to, nothing ever changes, right, Ron? Nothing ever changes. So, but it became famous for tourism. And, the gold miners would write things about Yosemite or the Sierra, and people didn't believe it. From the east, did not believe it. Couldn't be, come on, 7,000 feet, no, nothing like that. So as soon as the railroad opened up, tourism started coming. And I'll show you in the film a couple of spots there. But they streamed out, and the railroad, they started later on. They became the Southern Pacific, the Central Pacific, and then they started Sunset Magazine. They built the Del Monte Hotel and other tourist attractions. So it wasn't just railroad guys. It was a true vision about what they could do, again, to make money, but also to create and open up California to the rest of the country. So I got interested when Stephen Ambrose, probably familiar with him, the great author who passed away a couple years ago, wrote Band of Brothers, among other books, but he wrote a book about the Transcontinental Railroad. And at the time I was doing a long commute, I'm talking 5 hours, once a week out of town for a project. And I listened to the book on tape, and I thought, I've been in Sacramento on and off for 30-some years or 20-some years at the time. How come I don't know where these places are? It's just an idle thought, one of those thoughts you have, And so I started to kind of read about it, and one day I flew down to Los Angeles to do another film, and I sat next to my photographer, a guy named Brendan Compton. And we got to talking, and I said, yeah, railroad. And he goes, oh, I know an old timer. He knows where all these places are. I'm like, seriously? He said, yeah. I said, well, so I went and met the old timer, a guy named Chris Graves, who passed away this spring, last spring, unfortunately. And Chris, and you'll see him in the little clip, knew all the places, knew all the stories, and spent days taking me up everywhere. And, you know, his fee was a hamburger and 2 beers. So that was his fee. So without him, I would have never been able to do it. And I just am really happy with the way that it came out, because not that it's a great film, but it's just such a great story. And I think Sacramentans need to celebrate it and revel in it. And I wish more was done. I mean, it's very complicated. Those of you who have been to the Summit Tunnel know Union Pacific isn't real big on people, you know, trespassing. Obviously, trains are dangerous. I believe that enough of this site is not contingent to railroads that it should be much more accessible. They don't share that belief, and one of the reasons they don't is that they do maintain ownership of the property, and you know, through common domain it could be lost, I think. So they're very concerned that there are always rumors that they're going to reopen those tunnels over the summit, because you know, there's only 2 lines over the Sierra, this one and the Feather River route. Think about that, 2 rail lines over from all of Northern California. So as they get more and more traffic, and they continually do, the thought is that someday they might reopen that, which would be, I think, terrible, because when you see these tunnels, you'll say there's nothing like it. Tunnels carved out of rock by hand over the mountains, one of the most unbelievable accomplishments in my mind, certainly in American history and probably in world history. I was lucky enough that when and again, done by the Chinese, I ran into an old friend of mine this year, and he said, oh, you're doing films now? And I said, yes. Turned out he was running a cultural exchange between China and the U.S. called Colorful Planet. So he said, would you be interested in going to China if this comes about and talking about the railroad, because they're interested in it? I said, hell yeah. So, heck yeah. So in November, the day after the election, I was taken to Beijing and allowed to go to Beijing University and talk about the film, and they took me to the Great Wall. And there was always a story which I totally doubted as being true, that the railroad executives, Crocker and Stanford, had a story that they didn't want to hire Chinese, they thought they were too small, that they didn't have the skills. And Charlie Crocker, the construction boss, said, well, they built the Great Wall of China, didn't they? You know, I always thought that was apocryphal, and I think it probably is. But when you go and you see the Great Wall of China, and you kind of note that, I always thought it was, you know, kind of a flat wall. It's not. It's like a it's the damnedest thing. It curves around, it goes up and down, and you go, oh my gosh. So there are these kind of strange connections between that. So amazing thing to see, and amazing, hopefully we'll see more Chinese come to see it, because it is a tremendous testament to the skill and the hard work they put into it. So I'd like to see the railroad marked more. I mean, thank God we have the Railroad Museum here. But again, I don't think people identify Sacramento with this great achievement that if not for Sacramento, if not for the people of Sacramento at the time, it wouldn't have been built. And it was such a big deal at the time. They had to go sell bonds to the public. And the newspapers reported, and they said, everybody got behind it. You know, the milkman got behind, you know, the dairy. Everybody bought bonds. Everybody wanted it to happen. It was so important that they knew that this would put Sacramento on the map, that they all kind of pitched in and made it happen. So I want to show a few little clips, and I'm going to start here. I start out in Old Sacramento, but for purposes of time, how am I doing on time, by the way? I probably blew my whole time period. Oh, wow. So we start here in Auburn, which is, you'll see, the first real challenge that they had coming out of Sacramento. So if I'm able to play, did I point that way?
right next to the freeway. Its hilly streets offer great walking and wonderful vistas. Dating from the gold rush, the downtown is one of the best preserved in California. It's a home to artists and writers. It's a great town to walk around, especially in the fall when the leaves are turning, and you can catch a glimpse of a train chugging on one of the trestles, knowing they have done this for almost 150 years. At the eastern edge of town, a short hike from downtown, is a giant sculpture of a Chinese coolie, a testament to the men who helped build the road. This 22-foot-high monument was built by a local dentist as a tribute to the men who built the road. It's right next to the rail line, which has a quaint, old-time feel to it. But the real treasure is a secret, tucked behind some homes. It's called bluMoon Cut, and is one of the first engineering challenges the railroad faced. This is bluMoon Cut. You can see how narrow it is. The workers didn't waste any time or money in lining the sides of it with concrete or anything to hold it up. They literally blasted through here with black powder, loosening the rock and gravel and sand on the sides. Then, with shovels and picks, they had to cart all of this stuff out of here. The cut is 800 feet long. In all, the workers excavated more than 45,000 cubic yards of earth and rock. It's eerie and quiet inside, a passage seldom visited on foot. Today, Amtrak still uses the line, and passengers stare out the windows as the train gently slips through the narrow opening. Rumor has it that more housing may soon be built here, possibly erasing one of the true marvels of the 19th century. Here, just off the modern track and hidden behind a few bushes, is Tunnel Zero. Tunnel Zero is east of Clipper Gap. It is 711 feet long, bored through Wildcat Summit between Clipper Gap and Applegate, this to eliminate the 90-foot-high trestle at Deep Gulch. This tunnel was opened to traffic July 24, 1873. It was abandoned during World War II because PT boats were too big to fit through the narrow tunnel. A 20-minute drive up I-80 brings you to Colfax, named after Schuyler Colfax, former Vice President of the United States, whose statue now sits near the train station, usually ignored. It's a quiet, quaint town, 2,400 feet high, above the fog of the valley, and just below where the Sierra can deal a devastating snowstorm. The old train station is neat. It's well maintained. Old baggage carts and travel cases serve as reminders of the heyday of rail passenger service, as modern passengers board Amtrak for the start of the journey through the higher elevations. You can come out of Colfax on State Route 174. When you do, you'll see the Red Frog. In the parking lot of the Red Frog is one of the very few plaques that you'll find on the whole Transcontinental Railroad route. The plaque says, "View of the Cape Horn Promontory," and it's dedicated to the memory of the Chinese. It says that they were lowered over the face of Cape Horn Promontory in wicker bosun's chairs. Now that's not exactly true. We're going to take the road up to the point and see what really happened up there. Just a few winding miles outside of Colfax is Cape Horn, a hillside of soft thistle metamorphic slate that workers, many of whom were probably Chinese, excavated to build the road. You can see how easy it is to dislodge the rock. You can cut through it almost with a butter knife. 1,322 feet below flows the American River. The coursing current looks placid and peaceful from this elevation. The views of the river canyon are spectacular.
You have this grand overview looking over the American River Canyon down below. Back in the day, trains used to stop at Cape Horn and allow passengers to get out and to look over the edge.
There is no town or village here, but lots of romance and legend. Myth held that many of the Chinese workers were lowered in wicker baskets off the side of the cliff, dangling above the river, while they used black powder to blast and level a platform on the side of the mountain. But the river is way off in the distance, and the slope, while steep, is not a sheer drop to the canyon below. There's simply no evidence of workers being lowered over the cliff in baskets, but it makes a great legend and adds to the allure of the Transcontinental Railroad story. The track wends very gently around the mountain, a wide, graceful curve that provides plenty of room for the trains. It's a great area for hiking, high above the river, in the breeze, with trains echoing in the distance. Well worth the visit, but just don't expect to find any remnants of wicker baskets. Floods, fires, and commercialism have destroyed many motherlode towns, but hilly Dutch Flat transports visitors back to the 1860s. The Dutch Flat Hotel is a picture of Americana. The whole town looks like it should be placed in New England rather than California. Many Chinese lived here during and after the construction of the road. Most or all of the bodies have long been removed from the graves and taken back to China. The old site of Dutch Flat Chinatown, which once had a population of about 1,000 people, was near the railroad tracks, just a mile above the main downtown area. There's nothing much to see at the exit at Cisco these days, just a gas station, and nothing to recommend a trip up this rutted dirt road. But at the end is quite a find, the old town of Cisco, the place where the Central Pacific girded itself for the assault on the Sierra Nevada mountains, the most arduous part of the project. Today, you can easily find evidence of an old town. Nails and spikes are plentiful, just inches under the dirt. Buildings merge into the hillsides. You can see where the old shops and homes once stood. And imagine a community of 10,000 people gearing up for hard work in the High Sierra. Millions of people pass Red Mountain every year and hardly ever see it. Getting up it, even in a four-wheeler, is not easy. It's a narrow one-lane road clinging to the side of the mountain. And you never know who you'll meet around the next corner. And if they are bigger than you, well, time to back down the mountain a bit. It's a trip with a stunning reward at the end of the climb. Once on top, the most amazing views await you. On a clear day, you can see from the crest of the Sierra Nevada to the west and southwest into the Sacramento Valley, the Coast Range, including Mount Diablo. Lake Spalding lies just to the west. On Signal Peak, 7,800 feet high, is a stone building that served as a fire lookout from 1909 until 1934. A watchman lived up here on round-the-clock duty looking for fires along the route and dispatching emergency help via telegraph.
I found Signal Peak in 1942 on a mining expedition, prospecting expedition, for materials that were strategic to World War II. And the building was here. And after I had been here and talked to members of my family, they said, "Oh yeah, your dad's uncle was there for a short time." It had to be very early because he died in 1888. The farmer type telephone, the old type farmer phone, set on this wall in a wooden box. These nails are what supported the wooden base. And these poles are still from the old telephone line. Pretty well followed that mule trail, so if there was anything wrong with it, they could, climb up on them and repair it. These windows were all glassed in. And right in front of me was a post, concrete post about that high. And on top of this was a brass fire finder. And you had a fire here, you turned the arrow this way and got a reading where it was, or here, or here, or here, or here, or here, or there, so that you could call in snow shed fire at that point. Description from 1909, names K.E. Johnson, J.H. Toller, and R.R. Toller. They were the lookouts. Snow, 5 feet.
You can see why this was the lookout spot. From here you can see the miles of railroad lines snaking through the mountains, the old snow sheds, and marvel at the beauty and complexity of the route. A great place to stop on your trip is the Big Bend Visitors
2, where we go all the way from Summit Tunnels, at least to Promontory and maybe to Omaha. That'd be my dream. So 2019 will be any math majors in here? How many years? 150. Yes, we have a historian. I don't think he did the math that quick, but I don't know. Maybe he did. 150 years. So that will be amazing, I think. And so stay tuned for that. And I just want to finish, first of all, thank you all very much. I just love meeting people, and I hope it sparks your interest in this, and just spread the word that, Sacramento deserves more credit that it's getting. But I was researching another book, and it's called, a film actually called Hard Road West. And it just reminded me of not only the difficulty of getting to California before the railroad, the time, but the tragedy. So you either had to get here on a ship around the Cape, which is very dangerous, the Cape of South America, or walk. They didn't ride horses and wagons out here. They walked. They put the stuff in the wagon. Little kids walked. Imagine that, your age, walking out over the mountains. And they walked through what's called the North American Cordillera, which is one of the most foreboding, dangerous, arid, hot, alkaline areas in the world. In 1850, a woman named Sarah Royce, the mother of a famous Californian named Josiah Royce, become a judge and a writer, came out here, and they were in a wagon train, and they got to the 40-mile desert, which is outside Carson, last barrier to the Sierra, which was then a barrier, and they got lost. They were separated from the other people. They actually missed a cutoff to get the last water they could get over. One of the other women went ahead of them in a wagon train, said, "We won't forget you." This is in October. So they go up into the mountains. It's starting to snow. At the time, and this is not very well known, and I'm researching this as well, Sacramento, we are not we just become part of the United States, just become. Even before that, the people of Sacramento raised money to outfit riders and rescuers to go into the mountains every October to look for people, to rescue them. They sent the riders out. The riders got up to where the first wagon train was, already up in the mountains, and they ran into them, and they said, "Okay, you're all safe, right? Yeah, everything's good. Okay, you're going to get through the pass, no problem. You got a week or two before the snow comes." One of the women said, "There's another wagon out there, another wagon." And the rider said, and they were two young guys, probably 25, described as being young. And they said, "Well, our orders say this is it. This is as far as we can go. They have not authorized us to go any further." The woman said, "Let me see your orders." They handed it to her. She took them and she ripped them up. She said, "There's a mom, a 5-year-old, and her husband out there. Go get them." One rider looked at the other. He said, "I got a 5-year-old," and they went. And they got him, and they got him through the mountains. Other people weren't so lucky. Other people died. Cholera, exposure, hunger. So the railroad came. The pioneer, if you're a pioneer of California, one definition is anybody out here before 1869, because that's when the railroad connected. And after that, any lazy butt could ride on the train. So it's a great project. Again, thank you all for coming, and I'll be around to answer any questions or just talk and eat food and drink water. So thank you so much.
Alignment still exists.
My guess would be 80%. Well, from here to the summit, or to Truckee, I'd say about 80%. And then, yeah. Then when it does vary, it's... so in 1909, Harriman came in. And like I said, from the beginning, they straightened it out. So they would, do a bridge here or figure a better route. In 1909, Harriman came in and did a major re-scheme, if you will. But his major re-scheme was mainly in Utah when they went away from the promontory and moved it to Ogden. So that straightened that whole thing out. So here, really, it's very, very close to the original.
Really difficult to, up in the mountains to be changing any of those. And you'd have to have a real good reason to change any of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to think of where the biggest. Well, like if you go outside of Colfax, so they moved it maybe, I don't know, half a mile or so, probably over time. That Tunnel Zero was built in 1909. They moved some of that stuff there. So Harriman, who's the father of Averell Harriman, which I think is fascinating, but he was really a genius. Reorganized the whole railroad, and I always say railroads are like continuous improvement. They're never done. Even today, I think the UP spends $2 billion a year, something crazy on maintenance. Yeah, wow. It's an enormous amount of money. It's very expensive.
So those abandoned tunnels, when were they abandoned?
They were abandoned in the 1980s, and it's in the film. There is a it's called Mount Judah, I think. Yes. So that's the tunnel. If you take the train now, you go under a tunnel. So they tunneled through there in the 1980s, but they used that route all through the 80s. Yeah. Isn't that incredible? Yeah. On that China Wall, and to China Wall and everything, it was there till the 1980s.
I didn't know they took that away. There was a long tunnel through the Sierras in the 80s, and now you say it's...
Well, it wasn't a tunnel. These are the granite tunnels that they carved through. Yeah, and then now today it's under. There's a ski area there. You can walk. I walked up there, and it's a thoroughly modern tunnel. You can hardly see it. It's so modern. It's so sleek.
By Sugar Bowl? Is it by Sugar Bowl?
Yeah, is it Sugar Bowl? No, it's below Sugar Bowl. It's God, I'm bad on my ski resorts.
So did you say Tunnel Zero was built in 1909?
Yes.
Was that the abandoned one?
Yes. Yeah. So that was the one that was too small for the PT boats. I don't. I'm wrong.
No, because the original.
It wasn't abandoned in 1909. It was built in 1909. It was abandoned around the time of the war, is what I was told.
The original one went around the mountain and had some on the side of the mountain and some tunnels.
Which tunnel are you talking about?
Well, the old ones that now you would consider abandoned. But then in the 20s, they dug what I call the 2-mile tunnel straight through. And they kept the outside.
That's to the side, what I call the Coldwater Canyon route over there.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
And so once they dug the 2-mile tunnel, which is straight through, they still use the outer loop until, as you say, in the 80s.
Yeah.
In the 80s, they just abandoned.
Yeah.
So they used both for a while? Is that what
They
you're
used
saying?
both for a while.
Oh, did they? Okay.
Because
Well, when did they put the
2-mile
tunnel through?
was a single line.
Is that the Mount Judah tunnel then?
I don't know what they call it.
Well, that's the mountain it goes through. So I think it's.
Yeah,
So they built that. You said when?
I think in the 20s.
I don't think it. They might have, but if you look at it, that's not a 1920s tunnel.
They just reboard it.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Films for sale too if you want it.
Or they
$20.
take, double stacks.
Yeah.
My math wasn't that good, except that I was at the 100th anniversary,
Yeah, I figured you were.
and then I was at the 125th, and I figured I might make it.
What'd they do for 125?
Not much.
Yeah.
No, there was probably 1,000 people there, but in 100 there was probably 15,000.
Did you go to that?
Yeah.
In Providence?
Yeah.
So
Been there twice.
I have to ask you a question. So there's some, I can't remember who it was, Chinese group, and they claimed that they went to the ceremony and they were snubbed and not recognized, which I find very hard to believe. In 1969. Probably don't remember.
I can't remember hearing anything about it.
Maybe, I don't know. It seemed to be.
The tunnel you're talking about, on a trip to Reno, when you get up to the summit, is that the long tunnel you're in for 2 miles? Okay.
2 miles long. And then you come out and you go
Around the
from
Cold
there,
Canyon.
Cold Canyon, stand on the curve and back down into Truckee.
Hey, you like this? The tunnel you showed, the abandoned tunnel, That is about 200 yards off of Lene's parents'
Is
property.
that right?
And they live in Appleby.
So I've been trespassing on their property when I go up
No,
there?
but I've been in that tunnel a number of times. And then be on the other side.
But you're so bored.
You know what's interesting about that is that you, it's very hard to see it because it's in the middle of the tracks. So you got one tree, and then it's in the middle and the brush goes over it. I've walked past it. And I knew where it was and I walked past it. Didn't see it.
I want to get a bunch of drummers in the middle of this. And then on the other side, you've been to the point where it crosses over each other.
But it's true, because it
Yeah.
A little beyond that, I love that spot there too. Yeah.
has.
So when they got to Promontory Point, they line up perfectly right at the end, or they have?
Yeah, I think it's pretty close, yeah. I
They
can't
changed
remember.
trains?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, it wasn't different gauges, was it?
No, same gauge.
But it was political.
But,
I could just see those kind of different directions, and you're like,
No, I know, they were, you know, well, that's one thing. But what was more amazing was that in the tunnels, they had people going from each direction and they were right on.
Wow.
Right on. I don't know how, no one, I think, knows how they did it. But I think that there was a cavalry detachment or something that came out for the celebration from the east, and they rode the Union Pacific tracks, and then they transferred to the Central. They remarked how much smoother the ride was on the Central Pacific
Oh, really?
than it was the Union Pacific. So.
Now, that book is the companion to the video.
Well, it stands alone, but it also is, I think, a good companion to the video.
And it's got, if you want to drive, you have driving
Yeah,
directions.
driving directions.
And that's a great idea, and then it tells
It
you,
was the Railroad Museum's idea. They said, hey, nobody, why don't you go do that? Nobody's done that.
I see that Kyle Wyatt in the video there.
Sorry?
You had Kyle Wyatt in the
Yeah,
video.
Kyle's in the video. He's great. And,
Far away, yeah.
he was a big help, and yeah, it's just really kind of serendipitous the way it all came together. So.
have you taken the Zephyr all the way to the
No.
Lynette,
I'm embarrassed to say.
Jen and I, that little girl.
I don't have time.
That little girl, she wrote it, she doesn't remember. We're both from Chicago. I love that.
You already
ride.
said that twice, and I said it once. So.
What, was from Chicago?
The main message tonight was we're from Chicago.
Well, you know, but there was a lot of trains in Chicago because it was a crossroads.
Oh, yeah.
So I grew up in Evanston. So
Oh, no!
Okay, yeah, right,
Did
yeah.
you go to New Trier High School?
No.
I mean, you went to Evanston. High School.
ETHS.
Yeah. New Trier's in,
8010s is Horseshoe.
my cousins went to New My cousins went to New Trier. Well, thanks for coming. What's your
Thank
name?
you, yeah.
Bob McLean.
Bob? Pleasure.
You sound like a railroad buff.
He's a
yourself.
buff.
Oh yeah. Serious.
Bubba, how are you?
Good, you know, it's
Everything
fun.
going okay?
Yeah.
I'm happy walking along the railroad tracks. I think it's downtown.
His
I
granddaughter's
don't care
basketball
where, you
game
know.
over under
We,
15. That won their
we
last
never
game
not part of
40 to
it,
1.
but, we
I
did
said,
a
how'd you do up to
documentary
1?
on the Cantera spill up in Dunsmuir. So we spent a lot of time in Dunsmuir and we did a video of the whole route between the spill to the Cantera loop and the river and all of that. And so, we got funding to do it, and so we got PBS and stuff like that. But, Bill's been a little more.
I've been by there probably 5 or 6 times, and I'll be going by it in June. I'm taking a group to Seattle on the train.
Oh, you are? Okay, yeah. It's terrible the way it hits Dunsmuir at midnight, you know, because you don't get to do the canyon in the daytime, which is really a shame, but I'm sure they have whatever their things are. But, now,
It's been at least 2 or 3 times that we've gone by. We've gone by during daylight. Cantera.
oh, you have?
Because the train's a little late.
Oh, yeah, it can be very late, yeah.
And so, it depends on the traffic.
Yeah. Well, after the spill, part of the public relations was they ran a special train, and we rode through Dunsmuir up to Mount Shasta and back again, and then we trained running. But I love that we stay at these cabins in Dunsmuir that are right on the river and then right across from the railroad tracks. And in the middle of the night, the trains are like, well, how to tell, but you know, we love it. It's like, you know, and there's an overlook, and all those kids go running to the overlook of the mountain and the trains, and it's real, man.
Relatively easily undone.
All right.
Good, well, thank you for,
Yeah.
I'm not, a friend of mine knew that I was a trained nut, so he told me about it. So-
Yeah, well, we've got Steve Swat next time, and he's fairly well known, so I think we're going to try this. But, we're just a little local bookstore. I'm the video guy, and we got the video business. So my wife, these all came out of her house.
So what, in the video, do you teach people how to do it? Or do you...
No, I overlap a little bit with what Bill does. I've done a couple documentaries, but I do more in the way of like webcast. Like this was a webcast today, so I do medical training video and some how-to videos. We had worked together with a news station some time ago. Kind of a whole business for that in the news business, you know, but it's getting, I'll tell you, man, you see this, like anything like the flood now, and everyone's got a camera, and they're more willing to upload it. Well, that means that they're not paying a guy like me, but that's life, you know.
Instantaneous.
Yeah. Well, you know, you're always going to have change. But the thing with the webcast thing, it's not going to work for a while. We do the medical ones, and they're not fancy, but they're nicely done, and they're documented. And the one we did last week had 40 people in attendance, but then we had about 120 people around the country. We're talking about high-end people, physicians, researchers.
Do you do anything at UCD with the eye people?
With the eye people,
Eye people.
I did a long time ago, but they're so big over there now. I know they're.
I didn't know if you knew Mark Manis, he's the head of the eye department. Next door neighbor.
Yeah. So he is. And we did something, and we're kind of looking at what happens is the people that are going to contact, they move or get fired or whatever, and then the other people forget about them. But, yeah, no, it's marvelous. It's marvelous. You know, we also got that new telemedicine facility. And telemedicine is basically where you got people that are getting older and they really, it's hard for them to get out of the house. You can start out with getting on the scale in the morning rather than the scale. Like people that are weights fluctuating. Well, you have a scale that is accurate that sends the readings to the nurses. The blood pressure and the whole thing. And then even by like a little Skype, doctor can kind of determine your state of mind, you know, like, you look good, healthy, but if you're kind of down in the dumps, you can kind of tell that. So anyway, we got a whole facility on there. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities. Well, I'm starting on Social Security, so I'm kind of slide down there.
I've been at it for 10 years, so
What was your profession?
I was a general contractor.
Oh, I forgot to say,
Civil engineer.
Oh, really?
Webcast to come here.
What's your take on spillway?
Well, I think that when they first had the problem on the main spillway and they shut things down, they had to until they could get some idea. But then when they had to restart it and it held up from here on, you know, then they really were running the cage. You know, a couple of hours more would have been a real problem.
The thing I haven't seen is a really good explanation on what went wrong with the emergency spillway and how imminent the danger was and who made the call. Because I was watching it on television, right? I mean, thousands of people.
The problem was where the spillway was, lakes here, water comes over, it scoured out a lot of dirt, and the scouring was headed back.
Hey, thank you for coming by. Bye.
Scouring was headed back toward the.
Thank you, camera girls.
It's really a dead
Right, yeah.
No, well,
And they
one
thought
of
if
them,
it
yes.
went back too far, it would undermine the thing and it could collapse.
So at some point it was progressing that way, but then they had a news conference about an hour later, and at that time the sheriff said it looks like it's better. But I'd like to know who saw that and who made that call, because that was
Yes, I'm going to. No, I just want to make sure I.
keep a lot of engineers and everybody used to. Hey, have a good one. Enjoy your river. Oh, we don't have that one. We don't have a flyer yet, but we will. Yeah. We'll have it how we're getting it out.
When's that baseball?
I think of that every day when I
The
send my
baseball
check
guy
into the
is
franchise passport.
April.
April?
I think like April 1st or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, we'll email it out. Yeah.
Okay, so you're essentially.
Well, it's a nice facility.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming down. Yeah. Well, thank you. Hang in there. We had a long talk the other day.
Okay, that's just too late. Maybe my head's spin trying to figure out how we're gonna work that out.
Are you mailing out a check for something?
Yeah, looking forward to it.
No, I will talk to her. Yeah, no, it's a happy time.
I'm like, that's just.
Yeah.
Are you
Asian, Chinese?
Japanese.
Yeah.
And Polish.
You're Japolish.
Yeah, I don't get anything else coming up on the book.
So I knew there was a large Japanese.
One in LA last year for the single camera. And that last one didn't go too well. Probably okay with it.
Oh, the one that we did?
Yeah, we lost the signal.
Oh, that's right. That was true.
And then a lot were
Yeah,
during
yeah.
the war. And Dorothea Lange.
You fix it in post.
I know. I love having you guys, the camera guys. But I think the next time when I do it on that, request a fourth person and yes, monitor all the time.
Oh, I see.
And then if anything comes up, they can listen to those.
Very large.
But when it happens, I get so.
Where is that? Oh, you can't.
But they knew, there was a couple of little.
All right, well, hey, good seeing you.
All right, good to see you too.
Yeah, I have to come to one of those Legends things one of these days.
Yeah, the next one's in,
Yeah, some, and they would say,
April.
we know
It's
who
every other
bought
month.
Okay,
this
yeah.
land.
And Bill's on the board, or,
They say,
on the board, but he's
some
on the board.
people knew not to buy it.
Hey, Ron,
I'm
thanks,
on the
man.
board.
And they always claimed.
I'll see you soon, I hope. Yeah, he's the board. He's the big honcho.
I'm just the treasurer.
Take the pheasant up the food a little bit.
Well,
It's kind of,
we can't
Yeah,
find
that's
out
glad we
why
were
we
home.
price
It was
it.
like,
I know,
yeah.
I'm kidding.
I wish I had told you that.
I know, it's a great
You
deal.
know, the Japanese.
Everybody else wants like 25.
Anniversary just
Hey, you
happened.
guys hear
It's that big
we
exhibit.
ran into Mike Williams
Downtown?
at the,
And
you
last
know Mike
week-
Williams?
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Mike
sure.
Williams?
Yeah.
Photographer?
Yeah.
I wish I
And,
had known. I would've gotten
he's
this
just,
interesting.
he's still there, he's 50 now.
Oh, I know, he's,
And he,
instructable.
and he says, I guess now the web people want more out of them.
That's crazy.
We're,
I couldn't
we're
read it before.
the
Well, I think our next program in April is going to be Mike Carroll.
Yes, and,
Oh, great.
We're talking about
They said this one
How does
place
it
they
live
had
technology and
How does a guy like Mike Lurie do?
and while they were in the camps,
I don't know, I see him out there.
the Persian family they called them,
Well,
took the
they're
store
all-
over for them, they were gone.
I mean, you know, Orcutt and Marceline were my age.
And gave it to
Yeah.
them before they
Been
came out.
doing it a long time.
You know,
Getter's getting
they
heavier.
they're working all shifts and hours. And
I see, yeah, I see.
But the gear's getting heavier again.
Is it? Why is
By the
that?
time that you get on the light